November 1941. Vilnius, Lithuania. Feldwebel Anton Schmid sat in his makeshift office in a requisitioned building on the outskirts of the city, watching groups of Jewish workers being marched past his window toward the ghetto. The workers, men and women of all ages, moved slowly under guard, their faces showing exhaustion and fear. Schmid had been watching these processions for weeks, since his unit had been stationed in Vilnius. Each day brought new groups being herded through the streets. Each day the numbers seemed larger. Each day Schmid felt growing unease about what he was witnessing. Anton Schmid was 35 years old, a sergeant in the Wehrmacht, an electrician by trade who had been drafted into military service when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. He had served competently, if unremarkably, earning promotion to sergeant through steady performance of duties. His current assignment was managing a vehicle repair depot in Vilnius, collecting broken-down trucks and cars scattered across the region, repairing them, and returning them to German units. The work was unglamorous, but necessary. The German army in the Soviet Union depended on mechanized transport, and the brutal conditions destroyed vehicles constantly. Schmid's depot processed dozens of vehicles monthly, keeping German forces supplied and mobile. The work brought Schmid into contact with the civilian population more than most German soldiers experienced. He needed laborers to help with repairs. He needed workshops and storage facilities. He needed to coordinate with local authorities about requisitioning supplies and managing logistics. These interactions meant Schmid saw what was happening to Vilnius's Jewish population more directly than soldiers in combat units saw. He saw families being forced from their homes. He saw property being confiscated. He saw people being herded into the ghetto under conditions that were clearly intended to cause suffering. Most critically, he heard rumors about mass shootings occurring in forests outside the city. Rumors that tens of thousands of Jews were being murdered by SS Einsatzgruppen units in a systematic campaign to eliminate the Jewish population entirely. Schmid was not particularly political. He had not been a Nazi Party member before the war. He had not volunteered for military service, but had accepted conscription as civic duty. He was patriotic German who believed in serving his country, but who was not ideologically committed to Nazi racial doctrines. The persecution he was witnessing troubled him deeply. It violated his Catholic upbringing that emphasized human dignity and compassion. It violated his personal sense of decency and fairness. Most fundamentally, it was wrong in ways that transcended politics or ideology. People were being murdered for being born Jewish. Children were being killed. Families were being destroyed. This was evil, and Schmid recognized it as evil, even though acknowledging that what his own government was doing was evil created terrible moral conflict. Schmid's initial response to what he witnessed was paralysis born of feeling powerless to affect events beyond his control. He was one sergeant in a massive military machine. The persecution of Jews was official policy implemented by specialized units with Hitler's explicit authorization. What could one person do against systematic state-sponsored murder? The risks of resistance were enormous. Anyone who interfered with anti-Jewish actions faced arrest, court-martial, and probable execution. The Nazi regime tolerated no dissent on racial policy. Soldiers who questioned or obstructed persecution of Jews were treated as traitors who were undermining the war effort and the Führer's will. Schmid understood these risks and initially limited himself to small gestures that provided minimal help without seriously risking his own safety. He employed Jewish workers in his depot, providing them with safe employment that kept them out of more dangerous situations. He occasionally provided extra food to workers. He turned a blind eye when workers took materials that could be traded for necessities. These were modest actions that helped individuals marginally, but that did not fundamentally challenge the system destroying the Jewish community. The transformation from passive witness to active rescuer occurred gradually during late 1941, as Schmid came to understand the full scope of what was happening, and as he concluded that doing nothing was itself a choice that made him complicit in mass murder. The turning point came when Schmid learned about the massacre at Ponary Forest, approximately 6 miles from Vilnius, where Einsatzgruppen units were systematically murdering Jews by the thousands. The Jews of Vilnius were being transported to Ponary in groups, forced to dig pits, stripped naked, and machine-gunned into mass graves. Estimates suggested that over 50,000 Jews were murdered at Ponary between July and December 1941. The scale and brutality of the killings shocked Schmid into recognition that passive observation was moral failure. Schmid made a decision that would define the rest of his life and that would cost him everything. He would use his position, his access to vehicles, his authority as Wehrmacht sergeant to save as many Jews as possible from deportation and murder. He would do this knowing that discovery would result in his arrest and execution. He would do this not because he expected to survive, or because he believed his actions could stop the Holocaust, but because his conscience demanded that he resist evil even when resistance seemed futile. Schmid's rescue operation utilized his legitimate military duties as cover for illegal activities. His depot collected vehicles from across Lithuania and Belarus. This required travel passes, allowing him to move freely through occupied territory. It required vehicles for transport. It required facilities for storing equipment. Schmid used these resources to move Jews away from areas where they were threatened, to provide hiding places, to supply false documents, and to coordinate with Jewish resistance organizations working to save people from deportation. The operation was complex and required careful management to avoid detection. Schmid maintained his depot's official functions efficiently, so that superior officers had no reason to question his activities or to investigate his operations closely. He kept meticulous records of legitimate vehicle repairs to demonstrate productivity. He continued processing broken vehicles, returning them to units, and maintaining relationships with German authorities that depended on his services. This legitimate activity provided cover for his rescue work and created plausible explanations for his movements, his use of resources, and his contacts with civilians. Schmid's rescue methods varied depending on circumstances and opportunities. When Jews needed to be moved from one location to another to avoid deportations, Schmid provided transport using depot vehicles on missions that appeared to be legitimate military business. He created false paperwork indicating that Jewish passengers were workers being transferred between German facilities. The passengers rode hidden in trucks under tarps or in compartments designed to conceal them during inspections. Schmid himself often drove, using his rank and his confident manner to deflect questions from checkpoints and patrols. When Jews needed hiding places, Schmid arranged for them to stay in depot facilities, in requisitioned buildings under his control, or with sympathetic Lithuanians and Poles who were willing to risk their lives to hide Jewish families. He provided food and supplies to hidden families, using depot resources that he diverted from official uses. When Jews needed documents to pass as non-Jews or to travel safely, Schmid obtained or forged identity papers, work permits, and travel passes using official forms he had access to through his military position. The documents were often crude forgeries, but they were sufficient to pass cursory inspections, especially when presented confidently. Schmid's most important contribution was coordination with Jewish resistance organizations working to save people and to maintain some organization within the ghetto, despite German efforts to destroy the community completely. Schmid made contact with leaders of the United Partisan Organization, a Jewish resistance group in Vilnius that was helping people escape to forests where partisan units were forming to fight Germans. He provided the resistance with weapons that he diverted from depot supplies or that he obtained from sympathetic German soldiers who supported his activities quietly. He provided transport for resistance fighters who needed to move between ghettos or who were escaping to forests. He provided intelligence about German movements and plans that resistance leaders used to avoid raids and deportations. The relationship between Schmid and the Jewish resistance was built on trust that developed gradually through small acts of cooperation that demonstrated Schmid's genuine commitment to helping rather than entrapping people. The resistance initially suspected that Schmid might be provocateur, seeking to identify resistance members for arrest. German authorities had used such tactics frequently, but Schmid's continued assistance, his willingness to take enormous personal risks, and his refusal to accept payment or recognition for his actions convinced resistance leaders that he was genuine. The trust that developed allowed for more ambitious rescue operations that saved larger numbers of people. Schmid's rescue work saved an estimated 100 to 300 Jews during the period from late 1941 through early 1942. The exact number cannot be determined with certainty because Schmid kept no records of his illegal activities and because many people he helped survived by remaining hidden and did not emerge to testify about their rescues until decades after the war. Some people Schmid helped escaped to Soviet-controlled territory. Some survived in hiding until liberation. Some joined partisan units and fought Germans for the remainder of the war. The people Schmid saved included men, women, children, elderly, skilled workers, intellectuals, families separated by deportations who were reunited through Schmid's efforts. Each person saved represented victory over the Nazi machine attempting to murder all Jews in occupied territory. The risks Schmid faced accumulated with each rescue operation. German security services were alert for any sign of resistance to anti-Jewish policies. Gestapo and SS units investigated suspicious activities relentlessly. Informers were everywhere, including among local populations who betrayed Jews and their helpers for rewards or from ideological commitment to Nazi policies. Schmid's activities involved dozens of accomplices, including German soldiers who helped him, Lithuanian and Polish civilians who hid Jews, and Jewish resistance members who coordinated rescues. Any of these people could be captured and tortured into revealing Schmid's role. The operational security required to maintain rescue operations under such conditions was nearly impossible. That Schmid succeeded for as long as he did was testament to his careful planning, his ability to inspire trust and loyalty, and his extraordinary luck. The discovery of Schmid's activities came in January 1942, when Gestapo investigating the Jewish resistance network captured several members who, under torture, revealed information about German soldier who was helping Jews escape. The investigation focused on identifying this soldier and on determining the scope of his activities. Gestapo interrogators pursued leads methodically, cross-referencing information from multiple sources, checking military records, investigating German soldiers whose duties provided opportunities for the kinds of assistance described by resistance members. Anton Schmid's name emerged as the likely suspect. His position managing a vehicle depot explained how he could provide transport. His movements throughout the region explained how he could coordinate with resistance members in different locations. The timing of his activities matched the timeline of escapes and rescues that Gestapo was investigating. On January 13, 1942, Gestapo arrested Anton Schmid at his depot in Vilnius. The arrest was swift and without warning. Schmid had no opportunity to destroy evidence or to warn his accomplices. Gestapo seized documents from his office, interrogated his subordinates, and began systematic investigation of his activities over the previous months. The evidence against Schmid was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses testified about his assistance to Jews. Forged documents in his office bore his handwriting. His depot's records showed discrepancies indicating diverted vehicles and supplies. Most damning, Jews he had helped were captured and testified about his rescue activities, some willingly providing information in hope of leniency, others forced to testify through torture. Schmid did not deny his actions during interrogation. He admitted helping Jews escape and protecting them from deportation. He admitted knowing that his actions violated military law and Nazi policy. He refused to identify his accomplices or to provide information about resistance organizations he had worked with. His resistance to providing information that would endanger others resulted in brutal treatment during interrogation, but Schmid maintained his silence about details that would have led to arrests of people who had helped him. Schmid's court-martial occurred in March 1942 before a Wehrmacht military court that had jurisdiction over German soldiers accused of crimes. The charges were aiding enemies of the Reich, sabotaging anti-Jewish measures, misappropriating military property, and conduct unbecoming a German soldier. The prosecution argued that Schmid had betrayed his oath to the Führer, had undermined Germany's war effort, and had aided partisans who were killing German soldiers. The prosecution demanded the death penalty. Schmid's defense was minimal. Military justice under Nazi regime allowed limited defense for soldiers accused of political crimes. Schmid's appointed defense counsel argued for mitigation based on Schmid's previous good service record and based on claim that Schmid had been motivated by misguided humanitarian impulses rather than by treasonous intent. The court was unimpressed. The judges viewed Schmid's actions as betrayal of the worst kind, assistance to Jews and to partisans who represented existential threats to Germany. The verdict was guilty on all charges. The sentence was death by firing squad. The sentence was to be carried out immediately to demonstrate that the Wehrmacht would not tolerate soldiers who aided Jews or who obstructed racial policies. Anton Schmid was executed by firing squad on April 13, 1942, in Vilnius. He was 36 years old. Before his execution, Schmid was allowed to write a final letter to his wife Steffi and to his daughter Gertrude, who were living in Vienna. The letter, which survived and which was later published, expressed love for his family, regret that he would not see them again, and peace with his decision to help Jews despite knowing the consequences. Schmid wrote that his conscience had demanded that he act, that doing nothing in the face of mass murder would have been unbearable, and that he hoped his family would understand and would not be ashamed of his choices. The letter contained no regrets about his actions and no appeals for mercy. Schmid accepted his fate with dignity and with conviction that he had done what was right, even though it cost him his life. The execution was witnessed by German military personnel and by local officials. Schmid faced the firing squad without pleading for mercy and without showing fear. He was buried in a military cemetery in Vilnius. His death was recorded in military records as execution for high treason. His family was informed of his death, but not of the specific reasons for his execution, receiving only notification that he had been convicted of crimes against the Reich. Steffi Schmid, Anton's wife, lived the rest of her life carrying the stigma of being widow of a traitor. She faced harassment from neighbors who knew about her husband's execution. She struggled financially because widows of executed soldiers received no pensions. She maintained until her own death that Anton had been a good man who had acted according to his conscience, and that she was proud of him despite the consequences his actions had for their family. Gertrude Schmid, Anton's daughter, grew up knowing only that her father had been executed as a traitor. Only decades later did she learn the full story of what her father had done and why he had been killed. The revelation that her father had been executed for saving Jews rather than for some actual betrayal of Germany transformed her understanding of his death and of his character. She became advocate for preserving his memory and for ensuring that his sacrifice was recognized. The Jews whom Anton Schmid saved carried his memory through the decades after the war. some survivors emigrated to Israel after the war ended. Some remained in Eastern Europe. Some moved to Western countries. They carried stories of the German sergeant, who had risked everything to help them, when everyone else was either trying to kill them or turning blind eye to their destruction. These survivors testified about Schmid's actions when Holocaust historians began documenting rescue efforts in the 1960s. Their testimonies, collected and preserved in archives including Yad Vashem in Israel, established the factual record of Schmid's rescue work and provided basis for his eventual recognition as righteous among the nations. The recognition of Anton Schmid as righteous among the nations came in 1967, 25 years after his execution. Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Research Center, awards the title of Righteous Among the Nations to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. The award recognizes moral courage and humanitarian action in the face of genocidal evil. Anton Schmid's case was investigated thoroughly by Yad Vashem's commission based on testimony from survivors he had saved. The commission determined that Schmid met the criteria for recognition. He had saved Jews at enormous personal risk. He had acted from humanitarian motives rather than from expectation of reward. He had paid the ultimate price for his actions. In 1967, Schmid was posthumously recognized as righteous among the nations. A tree was planted in his honor at Yad Vashem. His name was inscribed on the memorial wall. His widow, Steffi, still alive at the time, was invited to Israel for the ceremony recognizing her husband's sacrifice. The recognition meant that Anton Schmid's actions were officially acknowledged as heroic resistance to the Holocaust, that his execution was recognized as martyrdom rather than as legitimate punishment, and that his memory would be preserved as example of moral courage in the face of ultimate evil. The Israeli recognition of Schmid created controversy in Germany and Austria, where Schmid's story challenged comfortable narratives about the Wehrmacht and about German society during the Nazi period. The post-war narrative in West Germany had emphasized that ordinary Germans, particularly ordinary soldiers, had not known about the Holocaust or had been powerless to resist. Schmid's story proved that ordinary soldiers did know what was happening to Jews, that some chose to resist despite terrible risks, and that the claim of powerlessness was not universally true. If one sergeant with limited authority and resources could save hundreds of people, what could have been accomplished if more Germans had resisted? The question was uncomfortable because it implied that more Germans could have done more to resist, but had chosen not to do so out of fear, indifference, or agreement with Nazi policies. The publicity surrounding Schmid's recognition in 1967 prompted some Germans who had known him during the war to come forward with additional testimony about his character and his actions. These testimonies filled out the picture of Schmid as person rather than as abstract hero. He was described as kind, decent, deeply religious man who had been troubled by Nazi racial policies from the beginning, but who had seen no way to resist until circumstances gave him opportunity and responsibility to act. He had not been resistance fighter in the dramatic sense of sabotaging German war effort or trying to overthrow the regime. He had simply helped people who needed help using resources available to him, accepting risks because his conscience demanded action. This ordinariness was actually more significant than if Schmid had been an exceptional individual. His ordinariness meant that other ordinary Germans could have done similar things if they had made different choices. The example of Anton Schmid influenced how Holocaust education addressed questions of resistance and complicity. Educators teaching about the Holocaust often struggle with how to present the role of ordinary Germans and ordinary soldiers. Teaching that all Germans were monsters or that all were helpless victims of totalitarianism are both false and both prevent understanding of how genocides occur and how they can be resisted. Anton Schmid's story provides example of ordinary person who made extraordinary moral choice despite terrible risks. Teaching about Schmid allows educators to discuss moral agency, the possibility and cost of resistance, and the reality that people had choices even under totalitarian regimes. These are essential lessons that extend beyond Holocaust education to contemporary questions about resistance to injustice and about individual responsibility in the face of evil. The dramatic presentation of Anton Schmid's story came through various media over decades following his recognition by Yad Vashem. Books, documentary films, television dramas, and theatrical productions told his story to audiences who might never have learned about him otherwise. Each telling emphasized different aspects of the story, depending on the medium and the creator's focus. Some presentations emphasized the rescue operations and the dramatic tension of evading detection. Some focused on Schmid's moral development from passive witness to active rescuer. Some concentrated on his trial and execution as martyrdom. Some explored the post-war recognition and its meaning for understanding German responsibility and resistance during the Holocaust. The most influential dramatic presentation was a 1965 play by German playwright Rolf Hochhuth titled The Deputy, which included Schmid as character representing moral resistance to the Holocaust. The play sparked intense controversy in Germany by arguing that Pope Pius V and the Catholic Church had failed to speak out against the Holocaust forcefully enough. Schmid appeared in the play as counterpoint to the Pope, ordinary Catholic who acted on Christian principles to save Jews, while church leadership remained silent. The play's impact extended beyond theatrical circles into political and religious debates about responsibility and complicity during the Holocaust. The philosopher Hannah Arendt mentioned Anton Schmid in her controversial 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which coined the phrase, the banality of evil, to describe how ordinary people participated in genocide through bureaucratic processes without recognizing the evil they were enabling. Arendt cited Schmid as counterexample to the banality of evil, as person who recognized evil and resisted it despite being positioned within the system committing genocide. Arendt's mention of Schmid brought his story to intellectual and academic audiences who were grappling with philosophical and moral questions raised by the Holocaust. The contrast between Anton Schmid and Adolf Eichmann, both German soldiers serving in occupied Eastern Europe at the same time, illustrates the choices available and the different paths individuals took. Eichmann organized deportation and murder of millions of Jews, claiming afterward that he was merely following orders and had no moral responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Schmid resisted deportation and murder of Jews, recognizing that following orders to participate in or ignore genocide was morally intolerable regardless of consequences for refusing. Eichmann survived the war, escaped to Argentina, was captured by Israeli agents in 1960, was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, and was executed in 1962 for crimes against humanity. Schmid died in 1942, executed by his own government for refusing to participate in crimes against humanity. The juxtaposition of their fates, the organizer of genocide surviving for nearly 15 years after the war, while the rescuer was executed during the war, illustrates the injustice inherent to Nazi regime and the price of moral courage. The limited number of people whom Anton Schmid saved compared to the millions murdered during the Holocaust raises questions about the significance of individual rescue efforts. Schmid saved perhaps 300 people at most. 6 million Jews were murdered. His rescues represent 0.05% of Holocaust victims. From purely numerical perspective, Schmid's actions seem insignificant. But this calculation misunderstands what matters about rescue efforts and about moral resistance to genocide. Each person Schmid saved was entire world to themselves and to their families. Each person represented refusal to accept genocide as inevitable. Each rescue demonstrated that resistance was possible and that individuals had choices even under totalitarian systems. The significance of Schmid's actions lies not in the numbers, but in the demonstration of moral courage and in the preservation of human dignity in circumstances designed to destroy both. The Talmudic principle that whoever saves one life saves the entire world expresses this understanding that moral significance cannot be measured purely numerically. The commemoration of Anton Schmid in physical memorials has been limited because his story remained relatively obscure despite his recognition by Yad Vashem. There are no major monuments or museums dedicated specifically to Schmid. His name appears on memorial walls listing righteous among the nations. Some German cities have named streets or squares after him as part of efforts to acknowledge Germans who resisted Nazism. Educational institutions have named programs or scholarships in his honor. These memorials serve important function of keeping his memory alive, but the limited scale of commemoration relative to Schmid's sacrifice reflects broader patterns of how rescue stories are remembered or forgotten. The comparison between Anton Schmid's commemoration and the commemoration of more famous rescuers like Oskar Schindler reveals how fame and recognition can be arbitrary. Schindler saved approximately 1,200 Jews, roughly 4 times as many as Schmid saved. Schindler is internationally famous due to the 1993 Steven Spielberg film Schindler's List, which brought his story to worldwide audience. Schmid remains relatively unknown despite comparable sacrifice and despite the additional significance that he was German soldier resisting from within the military system rather than civilian industrialist operating outside military structures. The difference in recognition reflects film's power to shape popular memory and reflects the arbitrary nature of which stories become widely known. The psychological and moral costs that Anton Schmid bore during his rescue work cannot be measured precisely, but were certainly enormous. He lived knowing that discovery would result in his execution. He lived knowing that his actions endangered his family, who would face consequences if his activities were discovered. He lived with daily stress of maintaining cover while conducting illegal rescues, of interacting with German officials who would have arrested him instantly if they suspected his activities, of worrying about accomplices who might be captured and forced to betray him. He lived with knowledge that people he helped might still be captured and murdered, that his best efforts might not be enough, that the system he was resisting was vastly more powerful than any individual resistance. These stresses accumulated over months of rescue work and took psychological toll that Schmid bore largely alone because he could not discuss his activities with most people around him. The religious dimension of Anton Schmid's resistance deserves attention because it motivated his actions and shaped how he understood his moral obligations. Schmid was a devout Catholic who took seriously the Church's teachings about human dignity, about obligation to help those in need, and about standing against evil. His decision to resist persecution of Jews came from religious conviction that all human beings were created in God's image and deserved protection regardless of their ethnicity or religion. His willingness to sacrifice himself came partly from Catholic understanding of martyrdom as witness to truth in the face of evil. His final letter to his family expressed peace rooted in faith that he had done God's will, even though it cost him his life. The Catholic Church's response to Schmid's example has been mixed. Some Catholic educators and religious leaders have cited Schmid as model of Christian witness against genocide. Some Catholic institutions have commemorated him as martyr for justice. But the Church as institution has been reluctant to canonize or officially recognize him because doing so would highlight the contrast between Schmid's individual witness and the Church's institutional silence during the Holocaust. The discomfort with this comparison has limited how widely the Church promotes Schmid's example despite his embodiment of Catholic principles in action. The investigation of Anton Schmid's execution by post-war German authorities illustrates the complex process of dealing with Nazi-era injustices. Schmid's execution was legal under Nazi military law. He was convicted by properly constituted military court following established procedures. He had violated laws that were formally valid even if morally abhorrent. Post-war German courts that reviewed Nazi-era convictions faced difficult questions about which convictions should be overturned and which should be allowed to stand. Schmid's conviction was eventually declared void on grounds that the laws he had been convicted under were crimes against humanity, and that prosecuting someone for resisting genocide was itself illegal under international law. The declaration meant that Schmid's execution was murder rather than legitimate punishment, and that his memory was officially rehabilitated. The rehabilitation came decades after his death and provided no practical benefit to Schmid or his immediate family, but it established legal and moral principle that resisting genocide is not crime, and that laws enabling genocide are not legitimate laws regardless of their formal validity. The Austrian recognition of Anton Schmid came later than Israeli recognition because Austria was slower than Israel to acknowledge and commemorate resistance to the Holocaust. Schmid was Austrian by birth, having been born in Vienna in 1900, but Austrian identity after World War II was complicated by Austria's incorporation into Nazi Germany in 1938 and by debates about whether Austria had been victim of Nazi aggression or willing participant in Nazi crimes. The Austrian government and society initially emphasized victim narrative, minimizing Austrian participation in the Holocaust and in Nazi crimes. This narrative made it difficult to recognize Austrians who had resisted because recognizing resistors implied that resistance had been possible, and that Austrians who had not resisted bore some responsibility. By the 1980s and 1990s, Austria began more honestly confronting Austrian participation in Nazi crimes. This shift enabled recognition of Austrian resistance figures, including Schmid. Streets in Vienna were named after him. Educational programs incorporated his story. Official commemorations acknowledged him as Austrian hero who had resisted genocide at cost of his life. The delayed recognition reflected Austria's delayed reckoning with its Nazi past. The broader question of Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust, which Anton Schmid's story illuminates, became subject of intense scholarly and public debate in the 1990s through exhibitions and publications documenting Wehrmacht participation in genocide. The traditional narrative that the Wehrmacht had fought cleanly, while atrocities were committed only by SS, was challenged by evidence that regular army units had participated in or facilitated mass murders of Jews and civilians. The Wehrmacht exhibition that traveled through German cities in the 1990s sparked protests from veterans who insisted they had not known about or participated in atrocities. Anton Schmid's story was powerful counter-narrative to claims of ignorance. Schmid was ordinary soldier who learned about mass murders and who chose to resist despite terrible personal risk. If Schmid knew, other soldiers knew. If Schmid could resist, other soldiers could have resisted. The choices Schmid made highlighted choices that other soldiers did not make. This was uncomfortable truth that many Germans preferred not to confront. The educational materials developed to teach about Anton Schmid in German and Austrian schools emphasize multiple dimensions of his story. Lessons focus on moral courage and on making ethical choices in difficult circumstances. They explore the psychology of bystander behavior and the factors that lead some people to resist injustice while others remain passive. They examine the costs of resistance and the question of whether individuals can be expected to sacrifice themselves to resist evil. They discuss the relationship between law and morality, exploring Schmid's situation where legal duty conflicted with moral duty and where he chose morality over legality. These lessons aim to develop students' capacity for moral reasoning and their understanding that individuals bear responsibility for their choices even in coercive circumstances. The debate about whether Anton Schmid was hero or simply decent person doing what decency required, reflects different frameworks for understanding moral action. Some presentations of Schmid emphasize his heroism, his extraordinary courage, his willingness to sacrifice himself. This framing risks making Schmid seem exceptional and suggesting that ordinary people could not be expected to act similarly. Alternative framing emphasizes that Schmid was an ordinary person doing what any decent person should do, that helping people being murdered is not heroic but simply human, that what is remarkable is not Schmid's actions, but that so few people acted similarly. This framing emphasizes the moral failure of the many rather than the exceptional virtue of the few. Both framings have validity, and both serve different educational purposes. The heroic framing inspires by providing model of courage. The ordinary decency framing challenges by implying that everyone has capacity and obligation to resist injustice. The survival testimony from Jews whom Anton Schmid saved provides the most powerful evidence of his impact. Survivors described Schmid as angel in hell, as person whose kindness and humanity provided hope when everything seemed hopeless. They described specific instances of rescue: being hidden in trucks, being provided with documents, being warned about raids, being fed when starving. They described Schmid's personal qualities: his gentle manner, his refusal to accept payment, his genuine concern for their welfare, his tears when he learned that people he had tried to help had been captured and murdered. These personal testimonies convey emotional and moral dimensions that historical analysis cannot capture. They establish Schmid as real person rather than as abstract symbol. They preserve memory in form that connects directly with contemporary audiences. The institutional recognition of Anton Schmid by the German military has been complicated by the uncomfortable fact that Schmid was executed by Wehrmacht for resisting Wehrmacht's participation in genocide. The Bundeswehr, modern German military, has incorporated Schmid into its ethical training as example of soldier who prioritized conscience over orders. Barracks and facilities have been named after Schmid. His example is cited in discussions about the limits of military obedience and about soldiers' obligations to refuse illegal or immoral orders. This recognition represents significant shift from earlier post-war decades when Wehrmacht was portrayed as a apolitical professional force that had not been involved in Nazi crimes, and when resistors like Schmid were still viewed with suspicion by many veterans. The contemporary relevance of Anton Schmid's story extends beyond Holocaust education to broader questions about resistance to injustice, about moral courage in the face of authority, and about individual responsibility when confronted with systematic wrong. Military ethics programs use Schmid's example to teach about lawful disobedience of illegal orders. Human rights education programs use his story to illustrate both the possibility and cost of resisting human rights violations. Leadership training programs use his example to discuss moral courage and the capacity to act on principle despite severe consequences. Schmid's story remains relevant because systematic injustice, genocide, and human rights violations continue to occur, and because individuals continue to face choices about whether to participate, to remain passive, or to resist. The limited scope of Anton Schmid's rescue work, compared to the enormity of the Holocaust, sometimes leads to focus on what he could not accomplish rather than on what he did accomplish. Schmid could not stop the Holocaust. He could not save even a significant fraction of the Jews in Vilnius. He could not influence German policy or overthrow Nazi regime. His individual resistance was ultimately futile in terms of affecting overall outcomes. But this perspective misunderstands the nature of moral action and the significance of individual resistance. Moral action is not justified only by effectiveness in achieving large-scale change. Moral action is justified by being the right thing to do regardless of likelihood of success. Schmid saved the people he could save. He resisted the evil he could resist. That his resistance did not stop the Holocaust does not diminish the moral significance of his choices or the value of the lives he saved. Each person saved represented victory over genocide. Each act of resistance demonstrated that humanity could survive even in conditions designed to destroy it. The preservation of Anton Schmid's memory faces challenges that all historical memory faces as direct witnesses die and as events recede further into the past. The generation that experienced the Holocaust directly is dying. Soon, there will be no living survivors of the events Schmid participated in. Historical memory will depend entirely on preserved testimony, documentation, and educational materials rather than on living witnesses. This transition requires increased effort to preserve and transmit Schmid's story in forms that will remain meaningful to future generations who have no direct connection to the Holocaust. Digital archives, educational curricula, memorial sites, artistic presentations, and continued scholarship all contribute to preserving memory beyond the lifetime of direct witnesses. The question of whether Anton Schmid would want the recognition he has received is unanswerable but interesting to consider. Schmid sought no recognition during his lifetime. He did not document his rescue work. He did not publicize his actions. He helped people quietly and expected nothing in return. His final letter expressed no desire for fame or commemoration. He simply wanted his family to understand why he had made the choices that led to his death. This humility suggests that Schmid might have been uncomfortable with being celebrated as hero. But the recognition serves purposes beyond honoring Schmid personally. It preserves example for future generations. It challenges comfortable narratives about impossibility of resistance. It provides model for moral courage. These purposes would likely have mattered to Schmid, even if personal recognition did not. Anton Schmid died at 36 years old, executed for saving Jews from genocide. His death was terrible injustice, murder of decent man by evil regime. But his death was not meaningless. He died knowing he had acted according to his conscience, that he had saved lives, that he had resisted evil at enormous personal cost. He died with dignity and with peace, knowing he had done what was right. That his actions were ultimately punished with death rather than rewarded with recognition reflects the evil of Nazi regime, but does not diminish moral significance of what he accomplished. The lives he saved, the example he set, the memory he left, all constitute his legacy, and all demonstrate that individual moral action matters even when facing overwhelming evil, and even when sacrificing everything to resist.